Willie Jasper DARDEN, Jr., started breaking the law as a teenager, his criminal activities starting after he was caught stealing from a mailbox. Upon his first violation of the law at the age of 16, DARDEN was sent to a juvenile detention facility. After being discharged, DARDEN had trouble finding work and was eventually rearrested for cashing a bad check. He received a 4-year sentence in prison for the bad check. Until the murder in 1973, DARDEN was repeatedly in and out of prison for a variety of crimes, including assault, forgery, theft, and attempted rape. At the time of the murder, DARDEN was on furlough from prison, while serving 20 years in a Florida prison for attempting to rape a 70-year-old woman in 1968. Willie DARDEN was born in Greene County, North Carolina on June 1, 1933. His family lived in poverty as DARDEN grew up. Because of his family's poverty, DARDEN could not attend school regularly and instead worked in the farms, eventually dropping out of school after completing the 8th grade. On September 8, 1973, at a time police estimated to be between 6 o'clock and 6:30 p.m., there was a robbery of a Carl's furniture store, located in Lakeland, Florida. During the robbery, James Carl Turman and his 16-year-old neighbor Philip Arnold were shot. Arnold survived the shooting, but Turman died. The robber also attempted to rape Turman's wife prior to shooting and murdering Turman. DARDEN was arrested later that day for a traffic violation. While he was in jail for the traffic violation, investigators tied DARDEN to the murder of Turman as well as a string of similar robberies and assaults in the area. Subsequently, DARDEN was charged with murder and robbery. DARDEN, an African American, was convicted by an all-white jury of killing a white man. The state intentionally excluded all African American persons from the jury. Intentional exclusion of jurors solely on the basis of race has since been found to be unconstitutional. Jury selection in DARDEN's case was improper, according to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun in his dissenting opinion. 3 witnesses: the victim's wife, the neighbor who was wounded in the shooting, and another neighbor provided conflicting descriptions of the suspect, but all later identified DARDEN. Initially, the victim's wife had difficulty describing the suspect. She was never asked to identify DARDEN in a lineup. She identified him in court, where he was the only African American male present. The neighbor injured in the shooting initially described the shooter as a man larger than DARDEN. Discrepancies in eyewitness accounts included whether DARDEN had a mustache and whether he was wearing a white or maroon shirt. DARDEN's lawyer failed to raise these discrepancies at trial. The time frame was key to securing DARDEN's conviction. Christine Bass had stated that DARDEN was in front of her house with a broken-down car from 4 to 5:30 p.m. She came to court daily during the trial to testify and was never called. Other witnesses, Brazen and Stone, had noted the time when they had contact with DARDEN. Stone, in particular, saw police cars in front of the furniture store at about 6 p.m. DARDEN, himself, called the sheriff's office to report an accident he had after his car was fixed. This was at 6:32 p.m., according to the sheriff's report. Yet the state was able to get a conviction. Years later, the victim's minister, who had been called to the crime scene at 5:30 p.m. and had arrived at 5:55 p.m., realized that this information was significant to the case. Both he and Christine Bass gave affidavits that would have strengthened DARDEN's alibi. The prosecutor used racist remarks and inflammatory statements to prejudice the jury. During trial, he repeatedly expressed a wish that I could see DARDEN sitting here with no face, blown away by a shotgun. In addition to evidence of Darden's innocence and evidence of ineffective counsel, the prosecution's racist and inflammatory statements should have been grounds for re-examination of this case. On its way through state and federal appeals, Darden's case was found sufficiently egregious to warrant review on numerous grounds. Darden was granted a stay of execution to allow the court time to consider his appeal. In all, he received 7 death warrants and 6 stays. He came within hours of death several times. In 1984, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals voted 7-5 to grant habeas relief to Darden. This decision, however, was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, which remanded the case for further consideration. On remand, the 11th Circuit denied relief. In 1986, Florida Governor Bob Martinez refused to meet with the witnesses whose statements corroborated Darden's alibi. He kept signing the death warrants as Darden lost in the courts. In an apricot-colored concrete holding cell at the Florida State Prison here, it takes 6 minutes for guards to free Willie Jasper Darden from the chains that girdle his body. It is routine procedure for an inmate marched down from death row to see a lawyer or a member of the press, and Mr. Darden, 54 years old, knows the routine well. He has lived longer on death row than any condemned inmate in America. During this time, inmates barely spend a decade on death row, and faces his 7th date with the executioner. Mr. Darden in 1985 came within 7 hours of execution before a court granted a stay to hear an appeal. In 1986, the Supreme Court affirmed the conviction in a 5-4 decision. After his conviction in the Lakeland killing, Mr. Darden pleaded no contest to the shooting, robbery and sexual attack of a woman clerk at another Lakeland store. I pleaded no contest to that other crime, because I figured I would be railroaded for that just like the one in Lakeland, he said in an hour-long interview. I was very afraid of being held in Lakeland for a second trial. There was a lot of race hatred. He says he did not get adequate representation at his trial from court-appointed defense attorneys, and only recently have witnesses come forward to claim he was elsewhere when the murder was committed. The police and the courts have rejected the alibi as well-intentioned, but clouded by individual recollections of long-ago events. Mr. Darden argues that the witnesses who identified him as the killer at his trial were pressured by the police, who were unable to turn up hard evidence to otherwise connect him with the killing. During Darden's time on death row, hundreds of people worldwide protested his death sentence, including Pope John Paul II, Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov, the human rights organization Amnesty International. Mr. Darden was one of 287 condemned men on Florida's death row. Only one execution has taken place in the state in the past 22 months before the execution of Darden, largely due to the state's decision to create a semi-autonomous agency, the Capital Collateral Representative, with 13 full-time lawyers and 6 investigators to defend death row inmates. On March 15, 1988, the state of Florida, with acquiescence by the federal government, executed Willie Jasper Darden, Jr. in the electric chair. His last words were, "I was not guilty for the charge for which I was arrested, and this morning I tell you I am not guilty of the charge for which I am about to be executed." Mr. Darden told 30 witnesses in the death chamber at the Florida State Prison, "I go this morning with a clear conscience. I bear no guilt. I'm at peace with myself, with the world, with each of you. God bless you." Mr. Darden winked and nodded at one of his lawyers just before the hood was put over his head. He was declared dead at 7:12 a.m. after 2,000 volts of electricity flowed through his body for 2 minutes. 2 puffs of smoke rose from his right leg where one of the electrodes was attached. Darden refused to select a final meal and was served the traditional fare of steak and eggs, orange juice, hash browns and coffee. He was 54 years old at the time of his execution. Thank you for watching Death Row.